Jason Statham gets asked a soul-shaking question by a little girl in a crowded community center. Does God really listen to people like you? What follows is an emotional roller coaster that leaves an entire town in tears. You won't believe the story he tells next. Like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this powerful and heartwarming encounter. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in a modest town tucked between the rolling hills of rural Oregon. The kind of place where people still wave at each other from their front porches, and a local diner knows your coffee order before you sit down. This wasn't a place where celebrities casually showed up, let alone action stars like Jason Statham. So when word got out that the Jason Statham was visiting the local community center to speak about overcoming adversity, the entire town seemed to pause. The community center was nothing glamorous. Chipped paint, creaky floors, and a gymnasium that doubled as a meeting hall. But that day it felt transformed. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the hardwood floor. Homemade cookies lined a plastic-covered table near the back, next to a coffee dispenser that had already been refilled 3 times before noon. Despite the storm outside, every seat was taken, the air electric with anticipation. Statham wasn't here promoting a film. He wasn't launching a product or filming a documentary. He was here because of a promise he'd made quietly, months earlier, after receiving a heartfelt letter from a 4th-grade teacher named Mrs. Klein. Her class had written him a stack of letters after watching an interview where he talked briefly about growing up in a tough neighborhood, how he nearly fell into crime, and how martial arts and discipline gave him a way out. But it wasn't his stunts or stories of Hollywood that caught the children's attention. It was something else, something quieter, something most people missed. It was a single sentence he had said offhand, almost beneath his breath. Sometimes, when I was really low, I'd talk to God, even if I didn't know if anyone was listening. Mrs. Klein had noticed. So did one of her students, a quiet, observant 9-year-old girl named Hannah. She had written him a letter of her own, one that didn't ask for an autograph or a selfie, one that asked a question so simple and so profound, it caught Statham off guard the moment he read it. Do you really think God listens to people like you? The envelope had no return address, just a name, Hannah, and a note scribbled in pencil at the bottom. I hope you answer this in person someday. I'll be waiting. And now here he was, on a Tuesday afternoon, under a leaking roof, standing on a makeshift stage with a microphone that crackled every few minutes. He was introduced simply. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest, Mr. Jason Statham. There was no grand entrance, no spotlight, just a man in jeans and a fitted gray sweater, his demeanor calm but serious. He stepped up to the microphone, gave a faint nod, and began to speak. I'm not great at speeches, he said with a slight chuckle, his accent unmistakably London. Never was. I'm more used to being kicked in the face, to be honest. Laughter rippled through the room. But I came here because of a letter. A letter from a kid named Hannah. The moment he said her name, a small girl in the second row stiffened. Her curly dark hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and her shoes dangled slightly above the floor. She clutched a worn-out copy of a children's Bible to her chest, the corners frayed from use. Jason glanced around the room, his eyes settling on her. You Hannah? He asked gently. She gave a tiny nod, her fingers tightening around the book in her arms. Jason's smile faded into something softer, not somber but thoughtful. He stepped off the stage, unplugging the mic as he did. The room was small enough that he didn't need amplification, and somehow, the silence made his words feel even louder. He approached her slowly, the crowd parting slightly as he moved. When he reached her, he crouched down until they were eye level. I got your letter, he said, and I've thought about it every day since. Hannah blinked, her eyes wide. Jason sat on the edge of the stage, his back to the crowd now, but his voice carried. You asked if I think God listens to people like me. Let me tell you a story. The room went still. Outside, the rain pelted against the windows, but inside, you could hear a pin drop. I grew up in a flat above a betting shop in South London. We didn't have much. My dad was a singer, a street performer mostly, and my mom worked at a dress shop. We got by barely. When I was about your age, maybe a bit older, I watched a man get beaten half to death in an alleyway behind our building. No one called the cops. No one stepped in. I just stood there frozen. He paused, eyes distant now. That night, I asked God why he let things like that happen. Why no one did anything. Why I didn't do anything. I didn't hear an answer. Not that night. Not for a long time. He looked back at Hannah. But I kept asking. Quietly. When I was walking home from school. When I was hungry. When I felt invisible. I didn't even know if I believed in God back then. I just knew I needed someone to hear me. Hannah's eyes glistened, her lips parting just slightly. I didn't get some booming voice from the sky, Jason said. No burning bush. No miracle. But I did start noticing little things. Small moments. A neighbor who slipped me a sandwich when I didn't eat for a day. A stranger who pulled me out of the path of a car when I wasn't paying attention. A teacher who told me I was worth something, even when I didn't believe it. He let out a breath. Was that God? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe that's how he talks to people like me. The room remained still, captivated, moved not by theatrics, but by the simplicity of what was being said. Jason stood now, but not to go back to the stage. He turned to address the room. You see, we think God only speaks to the good people, the perfect ones, the ones who never mess up. But maybe he listens more closely to the broken ones, the ones who've been knocked down so many times they forget how to get up. Maybe that's where he lives, in the spaces between who we are and who we want to be. He turned back to Hannah. You asked if God listens to people like me. I think he listens even harder, because he knows we're the ones who are still trying. And that was when her bottom lip began to tremble. She clutched the Bible tighter, her voice barely more than a whisper. That's what my daddy used to say before he left. Her mother, sitting beside her, looked away, eyes brimming with tears. Jason reached out, gently touching the girl's hand. I'm sorry you lost him, he said, his voice low. But I think he was right. Just then, the clock above the exit door ticked loudly. The rain outside began to ease. And for a split second, the entire room felt suspended in time. Like nothing else mattered except this conversation between a little girl and a man who had known silence, doubt, and darkness, and chose to believe anyway. But what Jason said next would not only break the silence, but shatter the emotional walls of everyone in the room. Jason's words hung in the air like the fading echo of a church bell. Soft, reverent, but lingering. Hannah blinked slowly, her small fingers still wrapped tightly around the spine of the Bible on her lap. The room, filled with dozens of townspeople, old farmers in plaid shirts, single mothers with tired eyes, teenagers in hoodies, sat in total, reverent silence. Jason didn't rush. He glanced around the room once, as if making sure they were still with him. Then he slowly sat back down on the stage, right on the edge, facing the audience, legs slightly apart, elbows resting on his knees. I said earlier that I used to talk to God when I was a kid. He began, his voice quieter now, tinged with something raw. But I didn't tell you when I stopped. The room shifted, almost imperceptibly. A weight settled over them. Even the air seemed thicker. I was 19, he continued, just a year out of school, still living in that same apartment, still hustling just to eat. And I'd gotten into diving by then, training hard, pushing myself. Thought maybe that was my ticket out. But I was reckless and angry. Angry at everything, at the system, at my old man, at myself. And then one night, everything fell apart. He looked down for a moment, his hands fidgeting slightly. I came home from training to find my best mate, Dean, unconscious on the couch. Overdosed. He'd been clean for 2 years. Said he was done with that life. But there he was, barely breathing, eyes rolled back. Gasps escaped a few lips in the crowd. Jason didn't flinch. I called for help. Stayed with him till the ambulance came. And while I waited, I dropped to my knees beside him, and I begged. He paused. I begged God to save him. I said, you could take everything else. Just don't take him. I don't know how long I was on that floor, holding Dean's hand, praying like a madman. But it felt like years. A beat passed. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. A woman in the 4th row let out a soft sob, muffled quickly by a tissue. Jason didn't react, but his eyes shimmered slightly. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall until sunrise. Didn't speak, didn't cry, just sat there empty. And when the sun came up, I muttered 4 words under my breath. He looked directly at Hannah, his gaze heavy with memory. "You're not real, God." Silence. Not one cough. Not one shuffle of a foot. Just rain tapping the windows like a heartbeat. "I stopped praying after that," he said. "Stop hoping. Stop believing. Told myself it was all nonsense. That if God was real, he wouldn't let good people die or kids starve or the world burn. I built this wall inside me, brick by brick, made of every broken promise and every moment I felt abandoned." He exhaled deeply, his eyes lowering. "And for years, that wall kept me standing. It gave me something to lean on. Cold, solid, unmoving." Hannah's hands had slowly uncurled. Her Bible now rested open on her lap, unread. "But walls can't love you back," Jason said. "They just keep everything out. The pain, yes, but also the healing. The joy. The answers." A man near the back nodded solemnly. An older woman clutched her necklace, a small silver cross between wrinkled fingers. "I kept climbing ladders," Jason continued. "Sports, modeling, Hollywood. Every rung I pulled myself up, thinking if I got high enough, I wouldn't feel that emptiness anymore. But no matter how high I got, I still felt like that 19-year-old kid on the floor." He glanced back at Hannah, then addressed the room. "And then, years later, I was filming overseas, some small country I'd never been to before. We were shooting in a remote village, not even on the map. And one night after wrapping, I went for a walk." His voice slowed now, like each word carried weight. "I heard singing. People leaned in. I followed the sound and found this tiny wooden church with no electricity. Just candles and a dozen people sitting on the floor, barefoot, singing hymns in a language I didn't understand." He looked up at the ceiling as if still seeing it. There was this old man, skin like tree bark, eyes like warm honey. He smiled at me, even though he couldn't talk. He motioned for me to sit. Jason swallowed hard. So I did, right there on the cold wooden floor, surrounded by strangers. And as I listened to them sing, something cracked. Not in the room, in me, like a soundless shattering. He pressed a hand to his chest. It was like all the grief, the anger, the guilt, the silence had all rushed out at once. And for the first time in almost 20 years, I cried. I didn't try to stop it. I didn't hide it. I just let it happen. He took a breath. And when I finally looked up, that old man had his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. And I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. He paused, eyes flicking back to Hannah. "Peace." The words seemed to settle over the room like snowfall. "I don't know if it was God," Jason said, "but it felt like forgiveness. Like someone had been waiting for me to come back. Not with shame, not with punishment, just open arms." Now, Hannah's eyes filled again. But she wasn't alone. The audience, once so still, had begun to shift in subtle unison. Heads nodding slowly, tissues rising to faces, hands gripping one another gently. Jason reached out a hand and softly closed the Bible on Hannah's lap, then looked her in the eyes. "You asked if God listens to people like me," he said. "I think he never stops. Even when we stop listening back. Even when we stop believing. Even when we break." A tear rolled down Hannah's cheek, but she smiled, not wide, not performative, just a quiet, heart-heavy smile, the kind that comes when something inside you is finally understood. "My daddy used to say that too," she whispered. "That even when we don't feel him, he's still there, waiting." Jason nodded, his own voice catching slightly. "Your dad was a wise man. The moment could have ended there. And perhaps it should have. But just as the crowd seemed to begin to exhale, an older gentleman stood in the back row. He wore a beige overcoat, clearly soaked from the rain, and leaned heavily on a wooden cane. His voice was gravelly but steady. "Mr. Statham," he said, "do you think people like me can ever find God again? After pushing him away for so long." The room turned toward him, not in judgment, but in quiet solidarity. Jason rose slowly, turned, and began walking back toward the stage. He paused before climbing up, placing a hand on the old man's shoulder. "I think the fact that you're asking means you already have," he said softly. A few people gasped. Someone sniffled. Others nodded, as if witnessing something sacred. Jason stepped back onto the stage. This time, the mic worked without a single crackle. And what he was about to say next would challenge every soul in that room to reflect on what faith really meant, not as an idea, but as a choice. Jason stood at the center of the stage now, one hand lightly gripping the microphone stand, the other resting casually at his side. The crowd before him was no longer just an audience. They were fellow travelers, souls unraveling their own tangled questions in the quiet comfort of shared humanity. His voice came softer this time, as if what he was about to say had lived inside him for years, waiting for the right moment, or maybe the right little girl, to bring it into the light. "You asked if people like you can find God again," he said, nodding toward the man in the rain-soaked coat. "I think some of us don't find God until we lose everything we thought mattered." He let that sit for a second. Sometimes it's not about climbing the ladder, like we talked about earlier. Sometimes it's about letting go. The crowd listened, not the kind of listening people do when they're just being polite. This was deeper, like something sacred was unfolding, something raw and real and entirely unexpected. Jason shifted his stance. "I want to tell you about the hardest decision I ever made," he said. "It wasn't a stunt or a role or a fight I walked away from. It was something no one talks about in the magazines or the late-night interviews." He exhaled. "Years ago, when my career had just started to take off, I was offered a role. Big budget, big names. Would have changed my bank account forever. But the part was something I couldn't shake. It wasn't violent, wasn't even offensive, but it felt empty, like I'd be selling a piece of myself just to be seen." He looked around the room. "You ever feel that?" he asked. "Like the world's offering you everything you ever wanted, but at a cost that doesn't show up in the contract?" The crowd stirred. A woman in the front row nodded slowly, her hands clasped together like she was praying, even if she wasn't aware of it. "I told my agent no," Jason said. "And for a while, I thought that was it. Career over. I went back to my little flat. I sat in the dark, and I felt stupid. I felt scared. I felt alone." He paused, and that's when I heard him. The room froze. "It wasn't a voice in the sky," he said quickly. "Nothing dramatic. It was something quieter, like a whisper inside me that said, 'Thank you for choosing your soul.'" A few people gasped. Others looked down at their hands, unsure of what they were feeling, but knowing it was something real. "I know how that sounds," Jason said with a sheepish chuckle. "I really do. I've punched people in movies, jumped from helicopters, driven cars through burning buildings. But the scariest thing I ever did was say no to something that could have made me rich, because I knew it wasn't right." His face softened. "That whisper, that peace that followed, wasn't mine. I hadn't earned it. I hadn't prayed for it. I hadn't gone to church or read a verse. But it was there, and it felt like God saying, 'Finally, you heard me.'" A long silence followed. Hannah was sitting taller now, her small shoulders squared, her fingers still resting on the closed Bible in her lap. She wasn't crying anymore, but her eyes shimmered with something brighter than tears, understanding. Jason scanned the room. "We think finding God means climbing a mountain, or lighting candles, or being perfect," he said. "But maybe God doesn't live at the top of the mountain. Maybe he's sitting at the bottom, next to the people too tired to climb." He turned his gaze to Hannah again. "You see, sweetheart, the question you asked, does God listen to people like me? It's the same question I've asked myself 1,000 times. When I've failed, when I've been angry, when I've hurt people, when I've hurt myself." He tapped the side of his chest. "And every time, the answer didn't come in a lightning bolt. It came in the quiet, in the stillness, in the voice that waits for you to stop running long enough to hear it." He looked at her mother now, a woman who had been silent the entire time, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's back. Tears slipped freely down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She just listened. Jason's voice grew firmer, steady now. "I believe God listens to the ones who feel forgotten, to the ones who sit in silence, to the ones who keep walking even when it hurts. Because those are the ones who are searching, not for perfection, but for meaning." He gestured lightly to the crowd. "And I know this might not be the kind of answer you expected," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "But Hannah, when you ask me what God means to me, this is it." He pointed to his chest. "It means not giving up on yourself, even when you're at your lowest. It It means finding the courage to believe that you matter, even if the world says you don't. He pointed to the audience. It means showing up for people, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you don't have the answers. And then he pointed to Hannah, and it means asking brave questions, like yours, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you don't know. The room was silent again, not because it was stunned, but because something sacred had just passed through it. You could feel it, like the gentle presence of something unseen but deeply known. Jason stepped down from a stage and walked slowly toward the back of the room. Every head turned to follow him. He stopped at a large window and looked out into the now fading rain. When my friend Dean died, he said quietly, still facing the window, "I thought God had turned his back on me. But maybe, just maybe," he was sitting beside me on that floor, crying too. The impact of those words hit like a tidal wave. A teenage boy near the exit started to cry. A woman 2 seats over whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Someone let out a long, shuddering sigh, like they'd been holding it for years. Jason turned back around, walked toward Hannah again, and crouched to meet her eye to eye. "I don't know if anyone's ever told you this," he said, "but your voice matters. Your question matters. And God, however you see him, however you feel him, he heard you, loud and clear." Hannah nodded, her face soft and glowing now with something gentler than joy, something deeper, peace. She opened her Bible again, flipped through the pages, and pointed at a verse her grandmother had underlined long ago. She didn't say the words aloud. She just let him read them. Jason's eyes scanned the verse, and something in his jaw tightened. He looked up at her, the edge of his lips twitching with emotion. "That's a good one," he said softly. "What does it mean to you?" she whispered. Jason smiled faintly, voice trembling ever so slightly. "It means we're never really alone, even when we feel like it." But just as the moment began to settle, something happened that no one expected, something that would send the conversation and the room itself into a place far deeper than anyone had imagined. A boy stood up near the back, maybe 12, maybe 13. He wore a baggy hoodie, his eyes downcast, his hands in his pockets. And with a voice so uncertain it barely reached the first few rows, he asked a question that made the room go completely still again. "Did you ever think about ending it?" The air left the room like it had been punched. Jason slowly rose to his feet, turned, and faced the boy. His face was unreadable, but when he answered, his voice was different. Not louder, not dramatic, but completely unguarded. Jason didn't speak right away. He looked at the boy who had asked the question, not with shock, not with judgment, but with a stillness that made the entire room lean in. The young man in the oversized hoodie had sat back down, his head now dipped low, as if afraid of what he had unleashed. But Jason's eyes didn't waver. He walked slowly toward him. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly against the wooden floor, mixing with the fading patter of rain on the roof. No one dared to speak. Even those who had come for curiosity or fandom now found themselves part of something far more personal, something unspoken. Jason stopped a few feet from the boy. "Yes," he said finally. The word wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it landed like thunder. The boy looked up, startled, his eyes red, but his face still unreadable. Jason crouched slightly, as if refusing to answer this question from any height but eye level. "I've never said that out loud in a room like this before," he admitted. "Not on camera, not to an interviewer. But yeah, there was a night. A hush fell like a blanket. I was about 25. I had no money, no place of my own. I was crashing on a friend's couch, not the glamorous kind you see in movies. This one smelled like mold and regret. I'd just been dropped from a project. My phone had been cut off, and I remember walking the streets of London that night, with 2 pounds in my pocket and no clue where I was headed." He glanced briefly at the boy, who was now sitting up straighter. "I walk along the Thames, past all the lights in the boats, past people laughing in restaurants. It felt like the whole world was moving, except me. Like I was a ghost no one could see." Jason's voice trembled just slightly, the words forcing their way past old defenses. "I sat on a bench near the water for hours. Didn't even feel the cold. I just watched the river, thought about how easy it would be to stop trying, to disappear, to end the pain. The boy's jaw clenched. Jason didn't flinch, but then a man walked by, just an old guy in a heavy coat. Didn't know me, didn't even look twice. But he dropped a sandwich on the bench next to me. Didn't say a word, just kept walking. He paused, blinking hard. I didn't touch it at first. I just stared at it. And for some reason, it broke me. This tiny act, this random moment, it felt like a message. Like God whispering, "Not yet. I'm still here." His voice cracked, just enough to make the room feel it in their bones. "I ate that sandwich with tears on my cheeks," he continued. "And it didn't solve anything. I didn't suddenly have a job. I didn't suddenly find happiness. But it was enough to get me through one more night." He turned to face the boy directly. "So yeah, I thought about it, but I didn't do it. Because one person who didn't even know I was breaking showed me I was still worth something." The boy wiped at his cheek with his sleeve, trying to be discreet. But the damage was already done. The question had cracked the room wide open. And in the silence that followed, something remarkable happened. An older man near the front raised his hand, voice trembling. "My son took his own life 3 years ago," he said. "He was 21. We never saw it coming. He never said a word." He looked at Jason, eyes glassy. "Thank you for saying what so many of us needed to hear." Jason nodded solemnly. Then he did something unexpected. He walked back to the center of the room, turned, and sat down on the floor, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees, like a man who was no longer interested in standing above anyone. "If there's one thing I've learned," he said, "it's that silence kills more people than bullets ever will. We're all so busy pretending to be okay, wearing smiles like armor. But it's the ones who speak up, who ask the hard questions, that change the world." He looked at the boy again. "You changed something in this room just now," he said. "You gave us permission to be honest. More tears, more nods. Something invisible was happening. Not magic, but something more grounded. Healing." Hannah, still holding her grandmother's Bible, raised her hand. This time, she didn't wait for permission to speak. I think maybe God doesn't answer with big miracles," she said. "Maybe he answers with sandwiches, or letters, or a hug from someone when you don't ask." Jason smiled. "Not the kind you give for the cameras, but the kind that reaches your soul." "I think you're right," he said softly. The boy in the hoodie slowly stood up again. This time, his voice was louder, steadier. "Thank you," he said. I didn't expect anyone to answer." Jason nodded. "I'm glad you asked." There was a long pause, and then a woman toward the back raised her hand. She looked nervous, her hand trembling. "I haven't stepped inside a church in 20 years, she said. "Lost my faith a long time ago. But tonight felt different. Like maybe I've been looking for God in the wrong places." Jason turned to her, still seated on the floor. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe he was just waiting for you to stop looking so hard. Sometimes he's not in the stained glass. Sometimes he's in the questions, in the people, in this moment." Another man stood, then a teenager, then a young woman with a child in her lap. One by one, people began speaking, not shouting, not preaching, just sharing. Doubts, pain, small victories, regrets, prayers they never thought were heard, grief they hadn't named until now. It was no longer a talk. It was a confessional, a circle of broken but beautiful people remembering that it's okay to be unfinished. And Jason sat among them, not as a star, not as a symbol, but as a man who had been there, who was still there, searching, asking, hoping. The little girl with the Bible, the boy with the hoodie, the grieving father, the woman with doubts, all part of a tapestry that had been woven together not by shared answers, but by shared courage to ask. As the final person spoke, a strange peace settled over the room. The rain had stopped outside. A single beam of golden light from the setting sun filtered through a window, casting a warm glow across the floor. Jason slowly stood, brushed off his pants, and looked around one last time. "You all reminded me tonight," he said gently, "that faith isn't a destination. It's a journey, and we walk it together, one honest question at a time." He looked down at Hannah. "You were the first step tonight, kiddo," he whispered, "and I'm proud of you." She smiled, tears glistening in her lashes. But just as the room began to settle and people prepared to leave, Jason turned back and said one last thing. A story, a memory, a revelation so deeply personal that it would forever redefine the way everyone in that room, including Hannah, saw not only him, but God himself. Jason stood still, silent for a moment. The energy in the room had shifted, not diminished, not drained, but transformed into something sacred, reverent. It felt like a church without walls. A sanctuary built not from stone or stained glass, but from bruised hearts and open honesty. He looked as though he might wrap things up, but then he turned back toward the crowd, toward Hannah, toward the boy in the hoodie, and he said, "There's one more thing I want to share." His voice was low, nearly a whisper, but everyone heard it. I've never told this story before. Not to a friend, not to a director, not even to my family. But I think maybe it's time. He took a breath and ran a hand over his head, not for effect, but like he needed to pause to gather strength. I was 7 years old, he began, and one night I woke up to shouting. My parents were fighting again. Loud, scary, the kind of fight that makes the walls feel like they're closing in. The room stiffened. Hannah's little hand clutched the Bible again, but gently now, like a lifeline. I was too small to stop it, too scared to yell. So I crawled out of bed and I hid under the kitchen table. It was the only place that felt safe. I remember wrapping myself in a towel. I don't even know why, maybe to feel like someone was holding me. Maybe I was hoping God would. Jason's eyes were far away now. Somewhere else. Someone else. I sat under that table for what felt like hours. The fighting didn't stop. And at some point I whispered, "God, if you're real, can you make it stop? Just for 1 minute." The room remained still. Not a shuffle, not a cough, just breathless, waiting silence. And then he swallowed hard. Then it happened. He looked up, his eyes glassy. I remember this so clearly. The yelling just stopped, mid-sentence, like someone had taken a volume knob and turned it all the way down. I could still see shadows moving across the hallway. My parents were still there, but the shouting had gone completely silent. I couldn't even hear my own heartbeat. People in the room blinked. A few exchanged quiet glances. No one doubted him. It lasted less than a minute, maybe even 30 seconds. But in that silence, I felt something. His voice cracked slightly. I felt warm, not on my skin, not like a blanket, warm on the inside, like someone had poured light into my chest. A tear slipped down his cheek, the first visible one of the night. I didn't understand it. I was 7. I didn't have the words. But in that moment, I felt held. I felt heard. I felt loved. He let that sit. And just like that, the fighting started again. Like someone hit the play button. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Not the same way. Because I knew that someone had heard me. Someone bigger than me. Kinder than the world around me. Jason stepped off the stage, slowly walking back toward Hannah. I've spent most of my life trying to explain that moment away, he admitted. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was all in my head. But when I sit with it long enough, when I'm quiet, I go back to that warmth, that stillness, that whisper of something holy in the middle of chaos. He knelt beside her one final time. That's what God means to me. Hannah's lower lip trembled again, but this time there were no tears of sorrow, only release. She leaned forward, not shyly, and wrapped her arms around Jason's neck. It was the kind of hug only children give, full, unmeasured, honest. And Jason, the man who had stared down villains, performed death-defying stunts, and navigated the stormy seas of fame, hugged her back with every ounce of sincerity in his bones. A few people in the crowd cried openly. Some clapped, but only softly, like they didn't want to break whatever had just descended upon the room. Then, from the side, Hannah's mother spoke, her voice quiet but clear. She's been waiting years to ask someone that question. Jason stood, gently resting a hand on Hannah's shoulder. She didn't just ask someone, he said. She asked everyone, and we're all better for it. The town's pastor, who had been sitting quietly in the back the whole time, stepped forward now, eyes full of emotion. This started as a guest talk, he said, chuckling through his tears. But I think we just at church. Laughter rippled through the room. Not nervous laughter. Not the kind people use to break tension. This was joyful, cleansing, the laughter of people who'd been carrying burdens too long and had finally set them down. Jason nodded once, then looked out over the room one final time. "Don't wait for the sky to split open," he said. "Don't wait for signs and wonders. Sometimes God comes in the questions, in the tears, in a sandwich left on a bench, in a little girl with a Bible too big for her hands." Hannah looked down at the book in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages. Jason started to step back, toward the exit, but paused again. "And if you're sitting there tonight," he said, scanning the crowd, "thinking you've gone too far, fallen too hard, lost too much, let me tell you this. If God could still whisper to a stubborn, angry, broken kid from South London, he can whisper to you too." A woman sobbed quietly. A man bowed his head. A young couple held hands for the first time in months. And in the center of it all, Hannah looked up at her mother and whispered, "Grandma would have loved this." Her mother, tears running freely, smiled and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "She did, sweetheart," she said. "She still does." As the crowd slowly began to rise, embracing one another, exchanging phone numbers, holding hands in silent prayers, Jason quietly made his way toward the door. No cameras, no entourage, no press, just a man who came to answer a question and left a room forever changed. Outside, the sky had cleared. The storm was over. The streetlights glistened on the wet pavement like stars scattered across the earth. Jason took one last look at the building before slipping into the night. Not with fanfare, but with peace. And somewhere, perhaps far beyond what we can see, a small, quiet voice smiled back.